Gold empires, those states that build their power on controlling gold resources or accumulating vast gold reserves, follow a remarkably consistent pattern of rise and fall across different eras and continents. From ancient Lydia that first minted gold coins, to Musa's Mali Empire that controlled West African gold fields, to the Spanish Empire fed by American gold and silver, to the gold rushes that shaped California and Australia, and eventually to the gold standard era when national power was measured in gold reserves. And the pattern is this. Initial discovery or control of gold creates rapid wealth accumulation and military power, attracting talent and enabling territorial expansion. The gold-based prosperity seems permanent and generates overconfidence in rulers, leading to military overextension and fiscal irresponsibility. The assumption being that gold will always cover expenses, but gold is ultimately sterile. It doesn't reproduce or generate ongoing wealth. It's just a store of value. And societies that depend on gold inflows rather than productive capacity eventually face a choice. When gold supplies stagnate or decline, they can either adapt by developing productive economies, or they can double down on gold dependence through conquest or debasement. And they almost always choose doubling down because the institutional structures and elite interests have become invested in gold-based power. And this leads to inflation as more currency chases the same goods, military defeats as enemies develop more sustainable economic bases, fiscal collapse as gold can no longer cover expenses, and eventually a rapid decline from seeming invincibility to irrelevance, sometimes within a single generation. And this pattern is so consistent across different cultures and time periods that it suggests something fundamental about how gold wealth differs from productive wealth, how dependence on a non-renewable resource creates specific vulnerabilities, and how societies that confuse accumulating gold with creating prosperity set themselves up for inevitable collapse. And understanding this pattern reveals why the modern abandonment of gold-backed currency, which seemed like a radical departure when it happened in the 20th century, was actually recognition of wisdom that should have been learned from the repeated failures of gold empires throughout history. That gold makes a terrible foundation for sustained economic power, that real wealth comes from productive capacity, not from hoarding precious metals, and that the glitter of gold is a dangerous distraction from the hard work of building sustainable economies. Lydia in the 7th century BCE was perhaps the first gold empire in the modern sense. They controlled rich gold deposits in western Anatolia, particularly in the Pactolus River where electrum, a natural alloy of gold and silver, was panned, and King Croesus, whose name became synonymous with wealth, accumulated such vast gold reserves that he could afford to make lavish gifts to Greek temples and to maintain a powerful army that controlled much of Anatolia. And Lydia was the first state to mint standardized gold coins, which revolutionized commerce and gave them even greater advantages. But Croesus, overconfident because of his gold wealth, challenged the Persian Empire, and according to Herodotus, the oracle at Delphi told him that if he attacked Persia, a great empire would fall. Croesus assumed this meant the Persian Empire, but it was his own empire that fell. Cyrus the Great defeated his gold-funded armies and conquered Lydia in 546 BCE, and the gold that Croesus had accumulated became Persian loot, funding Persian expansion instead, the lesson being that gold doesn't guarantee military success if your enemies have superior organization and tactics, and that overconfidence bred by gold wealth can lead to strategic blunders. Croesus had all the gold in the world, but it didn't save him from his own miscalculations. The Mali Empire in the 14th century was perhaps the most spectacular gold empire, controlling the gold fields of Bambuk and Bure in West Africa, which produced roughly half the world's gold at that time, and Musa's famous pilgrimage to Mecca in 1324, where he distributed so much gold in Cairo that he caused inflation and devalued gold in Egypt for years, demonstrated the almost incomprehensible wealth that West African gold produced. Musa traveled with thousands of attendants and hundreds of pounds of gold, and spent and gave away gold so freely that he disrupted the entire Mediterranean economy. But Mali's power was entirely dependent on controlling these gold fields. They didn't develop diversified productive economies, didn't build industries or agriculture beyond subsistence. The gold was extracted and exported in exchange for imports of luxury goods and weapons. And when the Songhai Empire challenged Mali's control of the gold fields and trade routes in the 15th century, Mali rapidly declined, couldn't maintain its armies or its territorial control without the gold revenues, and within a few generations had collapsed from being arguably the wealthiest state in the world to being a minor regional power. The gold hadn't created lasting economic development, had just created temporary prosperity that evaporated when the gold flows stopped. And this pattern would repeat with other African gold-producing states, brief periods of extraordinary wealth, followed by rapid decline when control of gold sources was lost. The Spanish Empire's experience with American gold and silver is the most thoroughly documented and analyzed case of gold empire collapse, and it demonstrates the pattern with exceptional clarity. Spain gained control of enormous gold and silver resources in Mexico and South America in the 16th century. The silver mountain of Potosi alone produced more precious metal than all previous sources combined, and the treasure fleets carrying this wealth to Spain made the Spanish crown the richest in Europe, able to fund armies that dominated the continent, to maintain the largest empire in the world, to build magnificent palaces and churches. But as we discussed with Philip II, this gold and silver wealth was a curse disguised as a blessing. It created inflation that undermined Spain's productive economy, made Spanish goods uncompetitive with those of nations that had less precious metal but more productive capacity. The wealth enabled military overextension. Spain fought wars on every frontier simultaneously, far beyond what even unlimited gold could sustain, and it created fiscal irresponsibility. Spanish kings borrowed against future silver shipments, spent money before it existed, assuming the treasure fleets would always arrive and would always be sufficient. But they never were sufficient because expenses always expanded to exceed revenues no matter how much gold arrived. And gradually the lenders lost confidence. Interest rates rose, and Spain entered the debt spiral. We discussed declaring bankruptcy repeatedly while still receiving more gold than any other state, proving that gold wealth without fiscal discipline and productive economy equals poverty. And when the flow of American precious metals declined in the 17th century, as mines were exhausted, and as Spain lost control of shipping routes to pirates and rivals, the Spanish economy collapsed. Entered depression that lasted over a century. Spain had gold and became poor, while the Dutch and English had less gold but developed productive capitalist economies and became rich, demonstrating conclusively that gold wealth is not the same as real wealth. The gold rushes of the 19th century, California in 1849, Australia in 1851, the Klondike in 1896. These created brief booms, rapid population growth, enormous wealth for a few lucky miners and for the merchants who supplied them. But the gold rush economies were inherently unstable, based on extracting a finite resource, and when the easily accessible gold was exhausted, the booms turned to busts. Miners left. Towns that had sprung up overnight became ghost towns. The wealth proved temporary, and the lasting development came not from gold, but from the agriculture and trade and industries that developed to support the mining operations and that persisted after the gold was gone. So California's real wealth came from farming and eventually from technology, not from gold. The gold rush was just the initial catalyst that brought people and capital. But the sustainable economy was built on productive activities, and this pattern repeated in every gold rush. The gold created a boom, attracted resources, but the sustainable prosperity came from what was built during the boom, not from the gold itself. And the places that understood this, that used the gold boom to develop productive infrastructure, prospered long-term, while places that depended on continuing gold production declined when the gold ran out. The gold standard era of the late 19th and early 20th centuries was the culmination of gold's role in defining state power. Nations accumulated gold reserves to back their currencies, and the size of reserves determined creditworthiness and currency stability, and countries competed to accumulate gold, treating it as the ultimate measure of wealth and power. But the gold standard created rigidities that would prove catastrophic. It prevented governments from expanding money supply to respond to economic conditions, forced deflation during recessions, transmitted economic shocks across borders, and as we discussed, prolonged the Great Depression by preventing the monetary expansion needed to fight it, and the gold standard's eventual abandonment, first by Britain in 1931, then by the United States in stages ending in 1971, marked the final rejection of gold as the foundation of monetary systems. Recognition that gold's limitations outweighed its benefits, that modern economies needed flexible money supplies, and that linking currency to a precious metal was a constraint that served no useful purpose and prevented necessary policy responses. But the transition away from gold was painful and resisted because gold had symbolic power beyond its economic function, represented stability and restraint, and abandoning it felt like abandoning fiscal responsibility. But the countries that left gold earliest recovered fastest from the Depression, and the countries that clung to gold longest suffered most, proving empirically that gold-based monetary systems were inferior to managed fiat currencies. The pattern underlying all these gold empire collapses is that gold creates wealth illusion. States with access to gold feel wealthy and powerful, but gold doesn't create productive capacity, doesn't generate ongoing income. It's just accumulated value. And when gold reserves are large, states are tempted to live beyond their productive means, to maintain consumption and military spending at levels their actual economies can't support, borrowing against future gold or inflating the currency by debasing coins or importing so much gold that inflation destroys competitiveness. And this works temporarily. Gold wealth can sustain unsustainable spending for decades, but eventually reality catches up. The gold runs out or is devalued by inflation or proves insufficient to cover debts, and the productive economy, which was neglected while gold was abundant, is too weak to maintain previous living standards or military power, and collapse follows. And this collapse is often rapid within a generation, because the institutional structures built on gold dependence can't adapt quickly to gold scarcity. The elites whose power depends on distributing gold resist transitioning to a productive economy where their skills might be less valuable. The military establishments built with gold funding can't be sustained when gold revenues fall. And the population accustomed to gold-funded prosperity resents the decline and sometimes rebels, creating political instability that accelerates economic decline. The comparison to oil in the modern era is instructive. Oil-producing states face similar dynamics to gold empires. They have abundant revenues from a natural resource that require relatively little productive labor to extract, and this creates Dutch disease, the phenomenon where resource wealth undermines productive sectors of the economy. Oil revenues strengthen the currency, making manufacturing uncompetitive. They fund government spending that crowds out private enterprise. They concentrate wealth and power in state hands, creating corruption and inefficiency, and oil states tend to become dependent on oil revenues, failing to develop diversified economies. And when oil prices fall or production declines, these states face crises similar to what gold empires faced. Venezuela is a contemporary example. Enormous oil wealth squandered through corruption and mismanagement, leaving the country impoverished despite having the world's largest oil reserves. And Saudi Arabia and other Gulf states recognize this danger, are trying to diversify away from oil dependence, investing oil revenues in productive assets and industries, attempting to transition before the oil runs out or becomes worthless due to climate policies. And whether they succeed will determine whether they avoid the fate of gold empires or repeat the pattern. Brief prosperity based on resource extraction followed by rapid decline when the resource is exhausted or devalued. The question of why societies repeatedly make the same mistakes with gold, why each gold empire seems to learn nothing from previous collapses, is answered partly by the time gaps involved. Generations separate the collapses, and institutional memory fades. Mali's rulers in the 14th century probably didn't know about Lydia's collapse in the 6th century BCE, and Spanish kings in the 16th century didn't study West African gold empires. Each gold empire thought it was unique, that its gold was different, more abundant or more secure or better managed, and the benefits of gold were immediate and obvious while the costs were delayed and diffused. Gold enabled current prosperity and military success, while the inflation and productive decline happened gradually over decades. So the people who benefited from gold wealth weren't around to suffer the consequences of gold dependence. And human nature tends toward short-term thinking, toward enjoying current wealth rather than preparing for distant future, and gold's symbolic power is seductive. It seems like real wealth, tangible and permanent, while productive capacity is abstract and contingent. easier to discount or ignore. So societies with gold convince themselves that they're different, that they won't fall into the trap, that they can have gold wealth without the accompanying costs, and they're always wrong. The few examples of gold producers that avoided collapse are instructive about what's required to break the pattern. The California gold rush led to sustainable prosperity because California used the gold boom to attract population and capital that then developed agriculture and eventually technology industries. The gold was catalyst, not foundation. And South Africa's gold mining industry didn't lead to general prosperity because the gold wealth was captured by a small elite and didn't fund broad-based development. But Norway's management of North Sea oil revenues through a sovereign wealth fund represents a successful model. They saved oil revenues rather than spending them, invested them abroad to avoid Dutch disease, and created a permanent fund that will provide income long after oil production ends. This is the opposite of the gold empire pattern. It's using resource wealth to build productive capacity rather than to fund current consumption, but it requires extraordinary discipline and institutional quality. Requires resisting the temptation to spend the resource revenues, and most resource-rich states lack this discipline. The political pressures to spend are enormous. Populations expect benefits from resource wealth. Leaders use resource revenues to buy political support, and the long-term thinking required to save rather than spend is rare. The abandonment of gold-backed currencies in the 20th century was recognition of gold's limitations. Modern economies are too large and dynamic to be constrained by the supply of a particular metal. Economic growth requires flexible money supply, and linking money to gold prevents this flexibility. Forces either deflation when the economy grows faster than gold supply or inflation when gold is abundant. And neither is optimal. Managed fiat currency allows central banks to adjust money supply to economic conditions, to fight recessions with monetary expansion, and to fight inflation with monetary contraction. This is much better policy than rigid gold backing. But the transition was resisted because gold represented constraint, and many feared that without gold backing, governments would print money recklessly, would inflate away debts, would destroy the currency, and some governments did exactly this. Weimar Germany being the famous example, but most developed countries managed fiat currencies responsibly, maintained low inflation, and achieved better economic outcomes than under gold standard. So the experiment with fiat currency has largely succeeded. Gold's role has been reduced to store of value and jewelry, no longer the foundation of monetary systems. And this represents collective learning from the failures of gold empires. Recognition that gold wealth is different from real wealth, that productive capacity matters more than gold accumulation, and that flexible monetary policy serves modern economies better than gold-imposed rigidity. The legacy of gold empire collapses is that we now understand, or should understand, that natural resource wealth is a curse unless managed extraordinarily carefully, that states with abundant resources face temptations that usually lead to economic distortions and eventual decline, that the resource wealth needs to be invested in productive capacity rather than consumed, needs to be saved for future rather than spent on current military adventures or consumption, and that the institutions required to manage resource wealth well are rare and difficult to build, require resisting short-term political pressures, require long-term thinking, require distributing benefits broadly rather than capturing them for elites. And most states fail at this, fall into the resource curse, become dependent on resource revenues, neglect productive sectors, and face crisis when resource revenues decline. This is the pattern of gold empires writ large, applied to oil and gas and other resource dependencies. And breaking this pattern requires conscious effort, requires learning from history, requires building institutions that can manage resource wealth rather than being corrupted by it. And the fact that most resource-rich states continue to fall into the trap, continue to repeat the gold empire pattern, suggests that this lesson is hard to learn and harder to apply, that the temptations of resource wealth are too strong for most societies to resist, that human nature and political incentives combine to produce the same failures repeatedly, making gold empires and their modern equivalents predictable failures, empires that rise on resource wealth and collapse when that wealth proves insufficient or becomes curse rather than blessing. Following the same pattern across millennia and cultures, rising rapidly on gold inflows, overextending militarily and fiscally, neglecting productive economy, and collapsing when gold proves insufficient to sustain commitments, leaving behind ruins and warnings that the next gold empire will ignore in its turn, believing that this time will be different, that their gold is special, that they can avoid the pattern, and being proven wrong in ways that future historians will document and future empires will ignore. The cycle continuing until perhaps we collectively learn that gold glitters but doesn't produce, attracts but doesn't sustain, and that building power on gold rather than on productive capacity is building on sand. And that why gold empires always collapse the same way is because gold creates the same temptations and the same vulnerabilities regardless of when or where it's found. And only the rare society with extraordinary institutions and discipline can resist these temptations and avoid the pattern, while most gold empires, dazzled by their wealth, believing themselves exempt from history's laws, march confidently toward the same destination, collapse following the same path, differing only in details, while the fundamental pattern remains unchanged.